Back to Policies and Pocketbooks. Thank you so much for joining me for another great conversation this morning. I am your host. I'm here every Saturday from 11 a.m. until noon on FM 105.5 and AM 660, The Answer. You could always streaming live the conversation at theanswerorlando.com or download our app at 105.5 FM and AM 660, The Answer on your smart device, and take the conversation with you anywhere. Tune in to my Facebook. We try to do a Facebook Live every Saturday when we're not recording the show. And or follow me on Twitter at Thuy Lowe. That is THUYLOWE. On the line with me, I have two great guests, and we're going to be talking about a very, very important topic. It's about criminal justice reform. It's a conversation that has been publicly talked about for a number of years, and I'm hoping that there is an end to this conversation, because we got to deal with this and we have to stop kicking this can down the road. It's about the First Step Act. So on the line, I have Mr. Nadra Enzi. He is with Project 21. He's considered himself as Cap Black, the hood conservative. And he's going to share with us his thoughts on this topic. I also have Reverend Derek McCoy. He is with CURE, Center for Urban Renewal and Education. He is going to share with us his thoughts on this topic as well. Now, both of them are very knowledgeable. Both of them have different opinions on where America should be focusing with criminal justice reform, and I would like to welcome both on Policies and Pocketbooks.
Thank you very much.
Now, Mr.
Thanks for having us.
Well, thank you. Mr. Nadra, you are calling from New Orleans, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. And then Mr. Derek McCoy, Reverend McCoy, you're calling us from D.C.?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Let me ask Mr. Nadra first. Explain to us briefly Project 21 and the goal and objectives behind Project 21.
Project 21 is a nonpartisan Black conservative think tank, which is part of the National Center for Public Policy Research. And it provides, if you will, the loyal opposition's voice to a lot of trending social and political topics. You know, just like any other community, not all of us think alike, vote alike, or hold the same opinions. And Project 21 for decades has been providing that differing view or differing voice to a lot of the current issues of the day.
Okay. Mr. Reverend Derek McCoy, share with us a brief background of CURE, Center for Urban Renewal and Education.
Yeah, well, CURE is located in D.C. We're about 2 blocks from the White House, across the street from the Press Club, and about a stone's throw from Congress. We really focus on fighting poverty and restoring dignity through a message of faith, freedom, and personal responsibility. We work in that particular aisle by doing 3 different things. It's a unique aspect, and it's born out of a little bit of a story of our founder's story, Star Parker, who found herself trapped on welfare, really in a place in her own life where, as she calls it, she was living in a wreck, and pulling herself out from that by the first piece of faith, and then applying principles of freedom and personal responsibility. So we work with the National Clergy Network, which we have as well, media, where we're trying to address issues of race, poverty, culture, and then also from a policy perspective and being engaged on policy issues, and whether that's being proactively writing policy or defending policy that we need to. But policy affects people's lives, because we don't do that, we can't change laws that change people's lives.
Okay. So I am getting the pros and cons on this new criminal justice reform, the First Step Act that is now being pushed through the Senate for a vote. I'm going to go with Reverend McCoy, Derek. Let me hear your thoughts on this criminal justice reform.
Well, no problem. Thank you so much. I think, for a long time it's been, this has been kicked around, as you had mentioned so appropriately before, about what do we do with criminal justice reform. I've worked on it before in the past, because one of the things we see is that 95% of our prison population actually will return to society at some point in time in their life. The challenge is the recidivism rates have been so high in the past that people just return right back in, and it's a revolving door. Now, I need to start off by saying prison reform in general, it's a huge, huge chunk. It's an elephant of a problem that we have in our country. If you look back in the 90s when President Clinton was in office, he really put forth a policy where it was, round them up and throw them in jail. And he was putting droves in jail. The inequitable sentencing was there where, a person who had a crime for crack cocaine and versus regular cocaine, those sentencing terms were very different. For crack, you might get 10 or 20 years. For cocaine, you might get 2 or 5 months. And so it was an interesting dilemma that they had in some of those points. I think with the current prison reform effort, where they're actually putting $250 million into this program, trying to actually lower the recidivism rate and actually make some strides, I think it's a notable stride forward with in a bipartisan effort to try and really make some inroads. There are some issues around this, but I think by and large, I got to look at it and say it's a good effort. I think, when you look at it quite honestly and say, we're supposed to do justice and love mercy. And I think it's one of those things where we got to understand that this thing where you're actually building in earn time credits into the aspect, trying to ease some of the minimum mandatory sentences and really reform some of the things, because there have been good advances in states like Georgia, Texas, Florida, and other states that they've actually had some good advances. And we have to try something different because, I live real close to Baltimore City. And if that's the model, we're in trouble.
All right, Mr. Nadra, let me give us your thought on this.
Certainly. First, let me start by saying I am a great fan and supporter of Star Parker and Cure.
Yes.
This particular policy, not quite as much. My grave concern is that in the name of undoing imagined inequities, because again, I've lived in neighborhoods where crack dealers have destroyed literally everything. I lived in the neighborhood. My whole start in security consulting and in safety advocacy was because of the violence, the theft, the family destruction that these same people that the First Step Act hopes to release serves. And it boggles my mind how we can make the center of our focus. And I really do think that if we're very honest about this, the Republicans are trying to put together a winning coalition for 2020, and they're being told that if you can adopt policies that attract more white independents and maybe some Democrats, that you'll be able to be reelected. And that's fine on the electoral map, but on the public safety side, the inner city does not need more felons being pumped back into it. Now, I'm speaking to you from New Orleans, Louisiana. And New Orleans usually ranks number 2 or 3 per capita as the most violent city in America. What we see when you remove mandatory minimum sentencing is what we have here in New Orleans. We have a system where no matter how many cars juveniles steal, no matter how many people are assaulted by some adults, they are released because of the discretion of magistrates and judges here. And some people may say, well, you're addressing over incarceration. But for those of us who have to deal with the over victimization, I work with crime victims on a daily basis. I work with people whose houses have been broken into, whose businesses have been disrupted, who have been attacked themselves. I understand that there, from the clergy and from advocates, that there's a great concern about trying to rehabilitate people, but I'm going to be very frank with you. 30 years into this, I've seen very little interest on the part of career criminals who have chosen drug dealing. You know, they weren't bitten by a vampire and became drug dealers, who have chosen drug dealing and all that comes with it. I haven't seen very much willingness from them to change their lives. I have seen a willingness to kind of con gullible people into believing that it's society's fault because you decide to become a predator against your own very low-income community. So those are my concerns in a nutshell.
Well, let me ask you this. This policy, this act, First Step Act, is getting a lot of support from bipartisan support from both sides. There are a lot of Black conservatives who are supporting this. Is there anything in this policy that you like, that you feel that maybe it should be pulled out and move forward?
To be quite candid, I'm very leery of the entire package. I really think that, and I understand the legitimate differences. Yeah. I'm 52 years old, so yes. For a lot of these cats, a lot of the younger conservatives, they look and they say, well, this is mass incarceration, there's mandatory minimums, but also for those who are doing electoral figures, they're saying, if we can, to quote the name of a conservative think tank that pushes this type of policy, if we become smart on crime, I think they're really hoping that they can gain more votes. And that's fine, but those of us who live in the cities where these felons are going to return know that they don't come back trying to become model citizens. They usually return to the same activities that put them in trouble. And we're talking about federal prisoners. So we're talking about people who sold drugs, disrupted their communities at such a rate that some component of the Justice Department had to investigate, arrest, and sentence them. And that should give anybody pause if you really want safety in the inner city.
Reference Derek.
Yeah.
What is it now? Mr. Nadra makes a lot of sense. Personal accountability. You know, if you do the crime, you have to pay the time, right? I mean, that just it's common sense.
Right.
How is this policy going to educate people that if you're going to do this, you are going to pay for consequences? How does that prevent people from getting themselves in that predicament in jail in the first place?
Well, that's a good question. And I think let me address the first side of it and hear me. I totally respect Nadra's position, and I get it. I'm one of the guys too. You don't want to see a floodgate of prisoners that are not rehabilitated coming back into society, especially into some of these distressed and challenged neighborhoods that we live right close to and I'm very familiar with, and try to say, let's try and work this out. We have a problem in our country. We have a problem in a lot of these areas around our country, and especially a lot of our urban cities, which, some of them are gentrified at this point, but the ones that we understand, we were just in Chicago not too long ago. We understand some of these other pieces. I was just in Wilmington, Delaware last week, just talking to people around this same issue, which has, by the way, one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country. So if you look at some of these things, it's challenging. So let me go back to your point. How do some of these policies affect it? I think, quite honestly, we have to look at, whether you're wherever you come from, Democrat, Republican, Independent, black, white, green, purple, yellow, we got to figure out solutions to these issues. And I think that's where we're trying to come from. And I'll tell the first thing, Nadra, I'll tell you the first thing. Me and Star have had a long discussions on these issues, and she's probably, a little more in the corner. And as we've talked and dialogued through it, definitely in the corner of, look, these folks have to pay for what they've done. At the same time, looking at some of these pieces where it is now, some of this reform, I call it is reform. It's not a one-size-fits-all. We can't look at the whole criminal justice system the same and say everything fits for everybody in every crime in every situation. Right now, some of those judges are just bootstrapped and hand-strapped because it is a minimum mandatory sentence. And if there are situations, and I'm just saying this, and I'm not saying the whole piece, but if there are situations where you do have a possibility of somebody that could be reformed, it's good to be able to give some level of flexibility to that judge that said, hey, we can work through this process, and not to the same point of that they just completely get off, because I'm not advocating that at all. I'm just looking at reforming so that there can be some level of equitability in some of those sentencing structures. I think the other side of it, as we look at it, quite honestly, there have been advances made, like in some of the states, and it's not just for total political gain where we are right now. And hear me, I get the point of, you got 2 years to go. Wouldn't this be a good one? Because this is a bipartisan initiative by and large. It was already passed in the House, and it was only, I think it was 58 dissenting votes. Everybody else voted for this. So it was a pretty wide bipartisan effort so far to get to where it is. The Senate is working on it. But reducing good time, increasing good time credit, if you look at that one simple aspect of it, that's not too bad. It's already in place now, but it moves it from 47 to 54 days. It looks at it and says they could actually get an additional week off for good time behavior if they actually work through the process. And we all know, I got too many stories of people who went through the system and really did rehabilitate their life and really did change, but it's because of the people that have been involved in it, not necessarily the system. But it's, you got folks in Prison Fellowship and many other places that go into the system, and many of these churches that we know of that are even within our network, they go in there week after week, day after day, and are trying to work with these prisoners and rehabilitate them. Not all come out the same way. There is hope, and that's what we got to believe for, I think, in our society. I could go further down the specifics of the legislation, but I'll take a quick breather, let you say something, because I can go down on this for a little bit.
All right. Well, folks, this is Thuy Lowe on Policies and Pocketbooks. You are listening to our two guests this morning. We're talking about the criminal justice reform. On the line with me, I have Nadra Enzi. He is with the Project 21. He considers himself as the hood conservative. And also on the other side of this policy, I have Reverend Derek McCoy. He is with CURE. He's the Executive Vice President of the Center for Urban Renewal and Education. This is a very important topic that we have been trying to resolve. We as a country has been trying to resolve for a number of years. So now we have this reform that's in front of President Trump. He's pushing for this. We have bipartisan support. However, there are pros and cons on this issue, and so we want to hash it out to see what you think about the new criminal justice reform that is waiting to be voted on through the Senate coming up here during this lame duck session. So I want to get back to the conversation, and I'm going to start with you here, Derek, Reverend Derek. You're talking about this reform is supposed to be helping sentencing, increasing good time credits for those who serve with good behaviors, and it's also talks about rehabilitation and job training. Isn't that
it does?
Isn't that something that is already in the system at the moment? And what is so different about this reform that is different, that is not currently available to these folks?
Well, you're right. There is a level of rehabilitation already built into the system. They're just trying to look at ways to potentially increase it and be more effective with it. I think, any good business would say, let's judge us by our metrics in terms of how are we doing? Are we doing okay? Are we not doing okay? What can we do better? And I think that's a key point for this, is that they're looking at some of those things. And hear me, I think one of the things we got to look at it's titled the first step back because it really is the first step. It's not a complete overhaul. It is not a conclusive aspect of this by any stretch of the imagination. By the way, even having understanding from the administration and looking at what they're talking about, they're saying, look, we're just asking people to get on board as a first step, as a progress forward to try and make this happen. And so I get Mr. Nadra's point of I'm a little skeptical on this, but if you look at it, they are going to, by putting the money actually into the process, that is actually going into some of the programs, the job training, and some of those other incentives that they're going to do. They believe that if they put the money into it and they actually do these processes, you will actually gain more on the back end because we'll lower the recidivism rate, meaning the people that are returning back in. Right now, that about 77% of state inmates and about 38% of federal inmates are rearrested in 5 years of their release. So within the first 5 years, they go right back in. And some of those numbers are probably lower in some areas, I'm sure, than in others. But I think if we're looking at trying to funnel some of those pieces in there and just make our, the way that they can earn credits and the way that they can do some vocational training. Because right now, you look at it, it's interesting, and I'll say this one. There's a story that's coming out, even up in Delaware area, in the Philly area. A guy was wrongly sentenced for 39 years. Basically, they found out after 39 years, or about year 35, other people got involved in the case, and now the guy's getting released 39 years later. But 39 years, he's been in prison. If you don't do something, and they hear me, I'm not the guy. I used to be on the side where, why do they need training? They don't need to get educated. They don't need any college. Why do they got to do that on our dime? But I also look at it now and look at it and say, 39 years later, they're at a time gap. Right now, if you don't have training in the next 5 years or 3 to 5 years in our technology and society, you lose it. You're not going to have a lot of productive jobs to come back out to. So I look at it, you got to put this element in there if we expect, if they do reform, can they come back into society and actually find a job? We know there are working programs right now that if they find a job and relocate to a place, not in the same neighborhood, but actually come out, relocate, and find a productive job in that area, there's a less likely chance that they're going to go back into those same situations, and less likely chance they're going to come back into prison. But if they stay in that same area, if they relocate, if they stay with the same people, do not relocate, stay with that same network of folks, and don't have a job, it's just a matter of time. One, they're going to go back, rob the same people, steal and create violence, and basically go back into prison at some point in the near future. We know that's going to happen.
Well, Mr. Nadra, you made a really good point that this proposed reform is an easy way out for a lot of these drug traffickings and drug traffickers and users. And many of the police departments across the country are not supporting this because they don't feel that these new policy is going to teach these criminals or these users of the problem in the first place. So how would you recommend, what's your thoughts on preparing people and making sure that they're not going to get trapped into this lifestyle in the first place?
I think that instead of giving
because I agree with you that criminal justice reform, that's a little bit too late. We need to deter people from getting involved in this kind of a lifestyle before they get there. So I want to,
which is why I was going to say that I would take greater comfort in the proposed legislation if the front end users in the community, community corrections, community supervision, community rehabilitation, were organizations like CURE, individuals like Star Parker, groups like Mad Dads, for instance, peacekeepers, on the ground in the communities, as opposed to the MacArthur Foundation, not knocking anybody, but just as opposed to outside entities. Let's fund people on the ground, from the clergy to the nonprofit to ad hoc organizations that are out there on a daily basis dealing with the same population that people are trying so hard to provide incentives not to offend. Now, that would make me, as a skeptic, far more comfortable because, again, responsible reformers, people with a proven track record in the community, coming from those communities in many cases, have a far better chance of generating the outcomes that the legislation hopes to have than just passing it on to the next hippie or the next frat boy who happens to have good connections and gets a job somewhere. That's so. Put Cure, put Star Parker, put that wing of the community on the front end of delivering these services, and I think that for hardliners like me, we can at least say that trusted advocates are at the helm, because otherwise we'll be having another conversation about how political cronies got the money, nothing was done, and now we've got this wave of recidivism in the very communities that the legislation was supposed to help.
Reverend Derek, how do we keep drugs away from our community, especially the Plight community?
Say that one more time. How do we keep drugs away from our community? And did you say the white community?
No, especially the Plight communities.
Yeah. Well, I think if I could answer that question totally, I would be a millionaire.
Right. I mean,
a billionaire.
I mean, this is the real question here. You know, it breaks my heart to see that the education system, we're putting so much money into these communities, trying to educate our children to have better lives, to stay away from crime things. And yet we are failing it miserably. What can we do? I know both of your organizations are working really hard to solve the problem, but how can we solve that problem? How do we begin? How do we begin to solve that problem?
And let me tell you one story of irony really quickly. Ben Jealous, former NAACP guy, president, was running for governor in the state of Maryland recently. And in one of his addresses, one of his commercials and then even his outward public statements, he basically said, hey, we need to fund the legalization of marijuana recreationally, not just medically, but fund it so that we can pay for the education of our kids in school and the education in the classrooms. And I thought that was the irony of that was so interesting. I said, we're going to fund legalizing marijuana to basically pay for educating our kids. And we then asked the question, how can we stop drugs from coming into our community? Well, it's duplicitous to think that we're going to legalize this around our country and say it's okay for the adult who's 18 years old, but it's not okay for the child who's 17 years old. And in our, in so much of our society, we have unproductive males, especially, that have checked out of society, checked out of working, checked out of, being productive fathers. And
Reverend Derek, I'm sorry, I am running out of time. I only have 19 seconds left now, but I want to invite both of you back for another conversation another day. And I thank you so much for being on with me on Policies and Pocketbooks today.
Absolutely.
Appreciate being here.
Merry Christmas to you both. Folks.
Thank you.
Folks, this is Thuy Lowe on Policies and Pocketbooks. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. And I want to wish everyone a very Merry Christmas.